Welcome back, everyone. This is part 5 of our discussion of the flu pandemic of 1918-1919. If you haven't seen the first 4 episodes, there's a link in the description that will take you back to episode 1. And as we have been doing, we are using extra credits, extra history, I guess we would call it, series on the flu pandemic as our discussion started. The link is in the description to their original content. Check them out if you want to see this without my commentary. Didn't do anything yesterday, so I apologize to those of you who might have been expecting this part 5 to happen on Sunday. Originally was hoping to do that, but we kept losing power, and I had a pretty full day already. We had a storm hit on our way home from church, and my church, it takes 50 minutes to drive home anyway, and so it took an hour and 45 minutes to drive home yesterday, and then I did the funeral for a friend from high school who sadly passed away from COVID, same age as me. So that was in the afternoon, and then my son had a high school soccer game in the evening, football to the rest of the world, against my high school. And I told him to take it easy on my high school, so what does he do? He goes out and scores 2 goals in the first half. Now remember, my son's in 8th grade. He's playing on the high school team. He's playing against 9th, 10th, 11th graders. And so he's had 1 goal in the first 4 games. And he goes out and gets 2 in the first half against my high school. And then he played in the second half in goal and shut them out. So, boy. Anyway, let's go ahead and dive into this. Couple things I want to let you know about upcoming. I am headed to France on Friday of this week. Man, I am so excited. You guys have been hearing me talk about this for like a month and a half. It's finally the week. We are here. If you want to see content from France as it's happening, a couple of things. Number 1, follow me on Instagram. If you used Instagram, I will be posting a ton of pictures every day from the battlefields of France. Give you a little preview of what you're going to see in the videos. That's totally free. Just follow me on Instagram. Second thing is, I'm going to post another video later this week, kind of as a preview to the trip. I'm going to show you specifically exactly what some of the videos are going to be. I've got planned something like 40 videos right now. I don't know if I'll get to them all, but I'll show you my list of what my videos are planning to be, where they're going to be from, things like that. I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview of what I've got planned while I'm there. I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about what's going to be going on, but also my plan right now is to actually post nightly recaps of what I saw and what I did. And I'll post those on the channel, and those will be available to everybody. However, for our patrons through Patreon, as well as our members here on YouTube, I will be posting raw video from the battlefields. Those are kind of previews of the actual videos that will be going up from the historic sites. The only way to see those is to be a member or be a patron. But I'll talk more about that when we get there. For now, it is time to dive into part 5 of the flu pandemic.
USS Leviathan. Splash. A body hits the water. Days earlier, armed military police had herded troops onto the Leviathan, sealing them in watertight compartments. It was quarantine, of a sort. If one trooper had the flu, it would only affect the bunkmates sealed in with him. It spread anyway. There is no more room in the sickbay, the mess hall, or any of the other makeshift hospitals.
Because remember, again, going back to the beginning, people could have this for several days before they showed any symptoms. So you put these guys into these rooms, there's probably already guys in each room that has the flu. And so they're going to spread it anyway. So even if they didn't seem sick at the time, there's a good chance somebody's carrying it.
Patients lie on deck in the sun and wind.
Ugh.
And bodies only have one place to go. At the rail, a chaplain mutters a prayer. Splash. Another man disappears into the Atlantic. Splash. In 6 weeks, the war will be over. Splash. Leviathan isn't the only plague ship. There are many like it.
And again, we've been talking about the parallels here between that and the current pandemic. And remember, one of the earliest things that happened when the current pandemic got started was they had a cruise ship off the coast, I think it was California, that was out there for weeks because people had the virus on it. And this was early, and we didn't know what to do, and nobody knew what was going on. And so they just left them out there. So same kind of things happening here.
Zealand transports HMS Tahiti and Mantua deliver the silent visitor to Africa.
Now it's interesting, Mantua, or Manoa, I think is a town in Italy. We have one in Ohio. It's up near Cleveland. We pronounce it Manaway. I know it doesn't look like that, but that's what we call it, is Manaway.
Africa. Infected ships pass the flu to dock workers each time they stop to take on coal. From there, it rides the rail lines into the interior, then spreads to the countryside on bicycles, horseback, or by car. Each of the 3 waves of the virus, the mild first wave, the deadly second wave, and the less lethal third wave, radiate across the globe. It storms every continent, sparing only Antarctica. Tracking the disease from the Surgeon General's office in Washington, D.C., Welch's friend and replacement, Victor Vaughn, expresses alarm at the flu's progress. If this epidemic continues at its mathematical rate of acceleration, he writes, civilization could easily disappear from the face of the earth within a matter of a few more weeks.
So obviously we understand a lot better how to calculate the growth and the peak of viruses and things like that than they did then. At that time, they're just looking at how fast it's growing, and they're just assuming it's going to continue to grow at that rate, but it doesn't really work that way. I'm not an epidemiologist, so I don't understand how it works, but I know that's not how it works. So, but we understand that now.
He looks at his map. Kimberley, South Africa. When people speak about the flu, they'll always remember the sound of hooves and wagon wheels. It's the sound of the collection wagons, heavy with corpses.
So there's a parallel going back to the times of the plague. You know, if you've seen the movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail, they have the spoof of that where they have the guy walking around saying, bring out your dead, and they bring out the guy who's not dead yet, and he's protesting that he's not dead yet, and they tell him, well, just, you're going to be dead in a minute, and they have this whole back and forth with the guy with the cart, and he says, well, could you stick around? It won't be long. And he's like, I think I'll go for a walk, you know. But it was, seriously, that's what it was. I mean, if you are in a family and you've got several people die, what do? You're not going to, I mean, the funeral director, I mean, and this is in a time, too, when you just didn't go to the funeral home and have a funeral at the funeral home like we did yesterday. You know, people had these in their homes. They had, you know, the front parlor of the house is where the body would be on display if they were embalmed at all. You just couldn't do that on this scale, especially when it hit a town and a lot of people died. The morticians couldn't keep up with it, so you got to, you know, go to things like this.
The people of Kimberley knew it was coming. Railway workers tracked its progress inland on the rail line. It advanced 1,000 miles within a week. Kimberley is a diamond mining city, the largest in South Africa, and people here live and work in close quarters. Migrant laborers sleep in crammed concrete bunkhouses famous for spreading sickness.
And this was a really common thing, and I want to talk about that for a minute, because even 60, 70, 80 years ago here in the United States, we had that. Where I live in Northeast Ohio, my wife's hometown is Niles, which is a few miles from where we live now, and 3 of my 4 grandparents grew up in Niles. And the reason they did is because their families were all from Kentucky. And to this day, not a week goes by that you don't see somebody from the town of Olive Hill, Kentucky, who dies in Niles, which seems really weird if you don't understand why. Well, in Olive Hill, Kentucky, which is this tiny town of like 1,000 people, they had a brickyard. They made bricks there. And there was a brickyard called Niles Fire Brick in Niles, Ohio. And Niles Fire Brick was expanding and needing workers. And they had a wave of Welsh immigrants that came in at one point. They had a wave of Italian immigrants. But the biggest wave of all of new workers to Niles Fire Brick came from Olive Hill, Kentucky. They bussed all these people up, gave them much higher wages, put them in company houses. And so my 2 grandfathers, my mother's father and my father's father, both grew up in the Niles Fire Brick Company houses on the same street. And so you lived in company housing. You bought most of your stuff at the company store. So you bought your food at the company store. You bought your home supplies that you needed at the company store. And so it was fascinating looking at my great-grandfather's income, because he made very little income, because most of his money that he earned from his job, everything was deducted from his tab at the company store, and his housing was deducted. And so by the time he paid all the money right back to the company for all his other stuff, he didn't have much to show for it. And so it was a real racket they had going on there. You worked for the company, you earned money from the company, but then you gave that money right back to the company to buy stuff from them. And so this is a really common thing.
People begin to fear each other. When someone sniffles in a shop, people turn away, veins turning to ice. The distinctive scent of the flu is like straw, they say. You can tell infected houses by the smell. Fear leads to dark places.
Yeah, it does.
Whites begin blaming their black neighbors for the disease, and within 5 years, their concern with hygiene will put forward a law that bans black South Africans from entering urban areas without a pass. It's another brick in the rising wall of apartheid.
So apartheid, long story short, and this was something that lasted, I think, into the early 1990s. Basically, even though the majority of people in South Africa were black, all the power was held by the white minority. And that's why you have somebody like Nelson Mandela, who becomes this incredibly heroic figure, because he was the leader that was speaking for that black majority and got imprisoned for decades because of it. And that's a whole other story we could get into at some point. But yeah, this is one of those early bricks in the wall, as they say.
Across South Africa, the trauma brings several village prophets to the forefront, preaching religious and social revival while describing visions they've had while in the grip of Spanish flu. Some later ally with the African National Congress to fight for political rights. They will be jailed or locked in insane asylums. The flu, with no concern for politics, rages on. It's good that the mining city of Kimberley is full of excavation equipment, because they'll need it for the graves. 2,500 miners die in the autumn wave, a quarter of the city's working population.
Wow.
By the time the epidemic is over, 9% of Kimberley's citizens are buried in the diamond sheltering earth. The country, the worst hit in Africa, will lose 500,000 people. But another colony will see at least 20 times more death. India. Traditionally, Indians cremate their dead on the riverbank.
Well, and India's got far more population, so it makes sense that they would have 20 times that number. Basically, a third of the entire world's population live in two countries, China and India. It's just amazing to think about.
And release their ashes into the Ganges. But there's nothing left to burn. Dead bodies clog the wide river, gathering in clumps. India is no stranger to outbreaks. Just 2 decades before, the country had battled Black Plague.
There's the pickle
but the
again.
behavior of
Sorry, I couldn't help it.
the British colonials during that time had made Indians wary of Western medicine. They'd herded people into health camps, burned personal possessions, and sprayed carbolic acid into homes.
Carbolic acid is something you don't hear about very often, and I don't know a whole lot about it, but I do know this, that at that time in history, it was widely available, and it was very often used as a way of taking your own life. You will find a lot of death certificates from that time period that show the cause of death as ingested carbolic acid as a means of suicide. It's a horrible way to die, but it was a pretty common thing for a while.
In other places, they did nothing at all. So even as flu whipped through the country, British officials offered little help and Indians accepted even less. Western medicine was largely reserved for the rich colonials or those in the cities. But there was an organization that tried to help. And often, they were the only ones serving rural areas.
Red Cross?
The independence movement.
Oh, we're in India.
In the rural villages, college-trained activists deliver medicine via bicycle or horse. Much of it is indigenous folk medicine that just managed symptoms, but given that every Western institute, from Rockefeller to Pasteur in Paris to Koch in Germany, had failed to produce a cure, it was no worse treatment than the ill received in the US or Britain.
Hey, at least they're trying. They're trying to do something. And, it's easy to look back 100 years later and judge and say, come on, homeopathic, holistic stuff. At least they're doing something, and they're trying to fight this thing, and I give them credit for that.
The message was clear. Articles in the Indian press denounced colonial neglect, saying British authorities cared little for Indians, and in their hour of need, the only ones who stepped up were the revolutionaries. They had the grassroots support they'd struggled so long to secure. And so, India took another step closer to revolution, its independence movement gaining legitimacy even as one of its most predominant leaders, Mahatma Gandhi, was out of action. The virus nearly killed him. According to recent estimates, between 14 and 20 million Indians died from the flu, the most from any single nation.
So let's pause and look at that for a second, because obviously India's got far more population than the U.S., but they also often have much more cramped conditions in many places. And in France, of course, you can understand. But these are some of the most populous nations, but also some of the most urbanized in some ways. The people living in cities and things like that. And of course, we probably don't have numbers for some places like China, for example.
And yet the flu killed on, affecting each country in its own way. Japan called it sumo disease, since the first outbreak exploded after a public wrestling match. There, the wearing of face masks became...
And there's precedent for that in other situations about naming a disease after a place it breaks out. I don't mean like a country, I mean like a specific place, like the sumo disease. We have something called Legionnaire's disease. And it first broke out among people who were at I think it was a American Foreign Legion convention or something like that.
Became so ingrained that it remains a practice today. It possibly killed 4 million on the island of Java alone. It raged through Russia and Mexico, both of which were in the flames of civil war. By 1919, it had penetrated even the most isolated regions. The Wood River, Alaska. Coast Guardsmen step onto the riverbank, calling out to the Yupik village. No one answers. They're in one of the most remote places on Earth. Here, it's not unusual to meet people who still think Alaska is part of the Russian Empire, ruled by the Tsar. Now, there is no Russian Empire, much less a Tsar. And though news of the revolution hadn't made it...
And Alaska's been part of the United States since 1867, so 50 years. But yeah, I mean, if people live out in the wilderness, if they're 70 years old plus, then easily they could think that. It was bought by the United States by, I think it was during Andrew Johnson's administration. Secretary of State was William Seward, and they called it Seward's Folly at the time, but then they found gold, and it became worth it.
The flu had. They've heard reports of devastation at the inland villages. The disease strikes native populations especially hard. The guardsmen are here with a doctor to offer medical aid and assess the impact. But the village seems deserted. Their ensign hears something moving in one of the earth houses and opens the door to investigate. He slams it and backs away, calling for a rifle. He then smashes in a window and fires into the house again and again and again.
Rats.
He only stops when everything inside no longer moves.
It's gotta be rats.
Then they douse the village with kerosene and burn it to the ground. For the rest of his life, he will never forget what he saw. 3 enormous sled dogs, starving and feral, fighting over the bones of a dead family.
Ugh.
As the guardsmen discovered in Alaska, Spanish flu proved to be especially deadly to native people with isolated immune systems. It slew its way across the Pacific, hopping from island to island out of New Zealand.
So why isolated immune systems? Because much like what happened when Europeans came to North America and spread their diseases to the Native American population, most of the time unintentionally, but occasionally intentionally. Those are diseases they've never been exposed to. Their bodies haven't built up an immunity to it. You know, you get a mild case of the flu when you're a kid, and you get it a few more times as you grow up. When this influenza hits, this major pandemic, your body's at least got some idea of how to fight that. But if you've never been exposed to anything remotely like it, your body hasn't built that that ability to suppress that with your own immune system. And so, brutal.
In Fiji, 5% of the population dead. In Tonga, 10%. In Vanuatu, it killed 90% of people in some villages, wiping out 20 unique languages.
Wow.
And then it reached Samoa. Pago Pago, American Samoa. Commander John Poyer, the naval governor of American Samoa, liked to follow radio reports on the wire. It gave him news from the war, from home. He could keep his finger on things. Suddenly, one item stuck out to him: Spanish flu in New Zealand. He'd been governor of American Samoa for about 4 years and knew Western diseases posed special danger to Pacific Islanders.
Yeah.
And with New Zealand having taken neighboring Western Samoa from the Germans, there was probably ship traffic passing between Auckland and Western Samoa's port of Apia. Poyer radioed his sister territory. Why, yes, they said. There had been a ship from New Zealand. And yeah, there was some local disease flaring up. Why? Poyer sent an order to the docks.
And see, he understood. The guy he's talking to, yeah, there's a local disease, and not a huge deal, but he's been following the news. He understands what's really going on here.
Close the port. No matter who comes, deny them the right to land. Dock them at the far end of the pier and move anyone ill to Navy quarantine vessels. Work with the villages to form shore patrols and catch those who try to sneak in. He radios a warning to his counterpart in Western Samoa and offers quarantine and hospital ships if needed. The governor of Western Samoa, offended by the aid offer, hangs up. 1 week later, a mail ship arrives from Western Samoa. A U.S. Navy vessel intercepts it. They can't land, the captain says, nor will Samoa or any American mail ship in its port except outside letters. They must return to Apia. Furious, the governor of Western Samoa cuts radio contact entirely, freezing diplomatic relations. By then, people in Western Samoa are beginning to die sitting up in their homes.
Wow.
Fields go fallow as entire families are unable to walk. There will be famine next year. A whole generation of village elders gets snuffed out. 22% of Western Samoa would die of Spanish flu, including a third of the male population. American Samoa continued its quarantine until 1920, until the last reports of Spanish flu subsided. It would be the only place on Earth that registered no flu deaths.
Wow.
The fever...
That shows you the difference that can be made by being proactive and things like that. And so, again, seeing the parallels, if you are a person in a place of decision making and you're looking at history and you see what happened before, even though it's a different pandemic, a different disease, you can see why some of the choices were made that were made. Now, we can debate whether or not they were the right choices or things like that, and I don't want to get into that debate, but you can see how learning from history has informed some of the decisions that have been made. As always, let me know something you learned in this episode that maybe you didn't know before. Use the comment section below, or share something with us that you can add to this particular part of the topic. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram if you use that, and be watching in the coming days for my big in-detail preview of my trip to France. Thanks for watching.